All right, good evening. I think we'll get started. My name is Tom Mickelson. I'm the President and Scientific Director at the Ontario Brain Institute, the OBI. We're a provincially funded non-for-profit, and we work to improve the lives of people living with brain disorders. We work with researchers, clinicians, industry, and patients around Ontario to ensure that the excellence we have in neuroscience is translated into real-world impact. Part of this role involves public outreach and providing opportunities for you to learn about the brain, its disorders, and some of the transformative work that's going on in Ontario. I'd like to thank you all, first of all, for gathering here on International Women's Day for a particularly important topic. It's a day that celebrates the social, economic, cultural, and political achievements of women across the globe. But the purpose tonight is to shed light on complex issues for anyone that are interested in intimate partner violence, to fight the stigma with knowledge, to stimulate our brains and challenge ourselves by continuous learning. Tonight's talks touch upon this important issue. 1 in 3 women worldwide experiences some form of domestic abuse, putting them at high risk for mild traumatic brain injury or concussion, leading to devastating psychological and physical harm. The problem of intimate partner violence is far greater than most of us realize. And it's important that we discuss these issues in order to work together to address them. This topic may be somewhat uncomfortable, but I think critically important today, and so I thank you for coming and engaging in tonight's talk. A video of the talk will actually be made available online, and we encourage you to share it with others and stay tuned for future talks on our braininstitute.ca website. We're proud to be partners with TVO, TV Ontario, in our public talk series, and tonight's talk is being live streamed at tvo.org and through our other social media channels. You're going to be also able to join the conversation through social media and direct message questions about the presentation this evening during the Q&A, and the Twitter handle is there. So first of all, I'd like to introduce tonight's speakers and our moderator, and after that there will be a Q&A moderated afterwards, and then I'll get out of the way. Our speakers tonight are Dr. Valera. She's an assistant professor at the Harvard Medical School. She's a researcher at the Martinos Center for Biomedical Imaging at Mass General. She's working to learn more about the traumatic brain injuries suffered by women in abusive relationships. Having spent more than 25 years in the field of domestic violence, Dr. Valera has worked with battered women and homeless shelters to understand the prevalence of intimate partner violence, related traumatic brain injury, and strangulation. She's published the first study examining the prevalence of intimate partner violence-related traumatic brain injury and its relationship to cognitive and psychological functioning. Deirdre Reddick will follow. She'll be speaking about her experience as a victim of domestic violence. She is a founding member of what's now called the Kingston Anti-Violence Advisory Council in 2009. And this is a group of survivors of intimate partner violence and sexual assault interested in sharing their experiences to educate and improve practices of our social institutions. From 2010 to 2014, she was the co-chair of the committee that was actively involved in creating awareness to local organizations. Deirdre has also been a keynote speaker at various conferences and involved in research projects studying aspects of intimate partner violence. Ruth Wilcock is the executive director of the Ontario Brain Injury Association, and over the past year, OBIA has been running an awareness campaign, Concussion Hits Home, which highlights the correlation between domestic violence and brain injury. Ruth has worked in community services field for over 30 years and is a registered psychotherapist with the College of Registered Psychotherapists Ontario. She continues to serve on numerous committees for special projects and research by representing the needs and concerns of those living with acquired brain injury. Our moderator is Heather Mallick. Tonight she's a staff columnist for the Toronto Star. She's a longtime feminist and observer of life. She's previously worked as a columnist for CBC.ca, the Globe and Mail, and many other media outlets. In 2015, she won the Landsberg Award for her work on feminist issues. Heather Mallick holds an MA in English Lit from University of Toronto, plus Ryerson journalism degree as well. So without further ado, we'll ask Dr. Valera to come up and be our first speaker for the program this evening. Thank you.
Thanks so much to all of you for coming tonight, and thank you very much to the Ontario Brain Institute for having me. This is a topic that I think is really important and incredibly overlooked and not appreciated. So what I'm going to talk about is intimate partner violence, and I'm going to focus on intimate partner violence against women. We can talk about details later if somebody wants. In the interest of time, I won't. It does happen to men as well, but from my research, for a number of reasons, I focus on women. So I just want you to bear that in mind. So what is intimate partner violence? Intimate partner violence is violence perpetrated against a spouse, a significant other, a partner, a boyfriend, or a girlfriend. Okay? And what happens in intimate partner violence? And here's where things might get a little uncomfortable. This is something people don't like to talk about or hear about, but the things that happen in intimate partner violence aren't just like a little shove here and there. They can be, and that's included. But some of the things that I'm worried about are women who get punched in the head with fists. They get hit in the head with bats. They have their heads slammed against walls and floors. They have their heads stomped on. They're thrown down stairs or off porches. They're violently shaken, and oftentimes strangled, sometimes into unconsciousness. Violence against women is the leading cause of intimate partner violence is the leading cause of violence against women, and homicide, in terms of intimate partner violence, that is the number one cause for homicide and for women globally. As you heard earlier, this is not a rare phenomenon. 1 in 3 women will report being a victim of either physical or sexual partner violence when asked. Not only that, but there are a lot of things associated with people who have been in physically abusive relationships. They tend to report higher rates of cognitive difficulties, problems with attention, remembering, concentration. Physical problems, so they have lots of headaches or migraines, maybe sensitivities to light and sound. Emotional problems. Oops, sorry, I forgot that. Here we go. Emotional problems, high rates of depression, anxiety, and PTSD. Now, if you look at this slide up here and you think about what I'm talking about, we hear all sorts of problems, and then we see things that are happening to women that could clearly cause brain injuries. And what we also know is that a lot of the problems that women report are the same problems that are reported by people who sustain brain injuries in, for example, athletics or car crashes or the military. Yet, when I looked at this topic 25 years ago, because I was like, oh, wow, this seems like an obvious thing. Let's see what's going on here. There wasn't a single article that I could find that addressed this issue. Either how many brain injuries women were sustaining, what the rates were, if there's associated with anything. There was absolutely nothing on this topic. So basically what I decided to do was say, okay, well, let's see what we can find out. And so what I'm going to do for the next few minutes is tell you about a few studies that I've done to try to better understand what is going on in terms of partner violence and traumatic brain injuries. Because even to this day, there's very little research out there. So what I did was I did a study. Here we go. And I interviewed 99 women. I gave them cognitive tests and tests of psychological functioning, anxiety, depression, worry, and a few other things. And basically what I found was, unfortunately, that 75% of the women reported at least one partner-related traumatic brain injury. What's even worse is that 50% reported repetitive partner traumatic brain injuries. So this isn't just, it happened once or twice, maybe 3 times. For some of these women, this happened more times than they could count. Like, for example, a couple of times a week for a year or something like that. And also, unfortunately, having more traumatic brain injuries, like the more a woman had, was associated with poor performance on tests of memory, learning, and mental switching abilities, and also higher ratings of general distress, depression, worry, anxiety, and post-traumatic symptoms. So basically we see higher rates of cognitive problems the more brain injuries they had, and higher rates of things like depression and anxiety. So clearly this is a problem that's completely unaddressed in the literature. So I didn't have much money to do neuroimaging at the time, but since then I have been able to get a little bit of money, but still it's very hard. But what I'm going to tell you now is about 2 studies that I've done that do involve neuroimaging. And I want to make sure, I don't want you to get lost in the details of neuroimaging. I just want to tell you that we do have evidence from neuroimaging that this is a real problem, and that we're looking into the mechanisms of what may be going on here. Because what we see in all of the other TBI literature may not be at all relevant to what we see here. Because the TBI literature that we know of right now is largely focused on men in athletics and in the military. And there's a whole host of psychosocial factors that are different between these women and those men. So, what I'm going to start by telling you about is 2 studies I did that were, one's on functional connectivity and the other is on structural connectivity. And so what is functional connectivity? Functional connectivity basically provides information on interregional correlations of brain activity. And so all that really means is it tells you, for example, if there's a brain region here and a brain region here, how much those brain regions are communicating with one another. Okay? It says, is this brain region communicating with another brain region? And then to what degree are these brain regions communicating with one another? So, So what I did was I used literature based on literature in other traumatic brain injury victims. I basically tested a hypothesis about whether or not we would see abnormalities in the communication between certain brain regions that were shown to have problems in other groups of people who had sustained traumatic brain injuries. So I said, can we see this if we look at women who have been in physically abusive relationships, measure the amount of brain injuries that they've had, can we see a relationship between that and communication in regions that we know are important? So the regions that I have up here, so you can see there's two dots, and then there's a connecting line. And those, you don't need to know the names of those regions, but just to know that those are regions that usually communicate with one another in a quote-unquote normal, healthy brain. And for someone who may have had a traumatic brain injury, a car accident or something else, those brain regions don't necessarily communicate as well with one another. And so we tested that in our women. And what we found was that the more recent and the greater number of TBIs a woman had, the less positively these 2 brain regions communicated with one another. And not only that, but the less these 2 brain regions communicated with one another, the worse a woman tended to be able to learn a list of words and remember that list 20 minutes later. So there we have a relationship between the number of brain injuries she sustained and not just some sort of amorphous thing that's going on in the brain, but a real meaningful, basically a meaningful thing that may occur in your life that you need to rely on, memory and learning. So the next thing I'm going to tell you about is structural connectivity. Now, I like this image just partly because it's really pretty, and it just goes to show that imaging isn't, all boring and ugly. And this is a really kind of uncomfortable topic and ugly, and it's just kind of brings a little bit light into it. But what I want you to see about here, because I want to try to help you understand a little bit about what I'm going to talk about in the structural connectivity, is that if you look at that image, what you'll see are a lot of little lines. And those lines are really axons. And axons are just little fibers in the brain, they're part of the neuron, that connect different brain regions. That's what we really need to know for this. And so some TBI research has shown that the water that flows around in those axons, the diffusion, gets altered after traumatic brain injuries. And this happens especially much for some of the longer fibers in the brain, because if you think about the brain and it's being knocked around, if you look at some of these fibers that are really long, it could be easy to imagine how those could get twisted and they may break or get injured if there's a lot of force. And so there is evidence that indeed concussions and the sequelae of concussions, what happens after concussion, is related to what's going on in these axons. And so we wanted to look at that in our women. And so we did that, and I'm just going to put this into a context that may be easier to understand. Now you can see the fibers within the brain. You can see there's a head there, and you can see the nose going over to the right. Basically, we selected a couple of fibers, regions of fibers that we thought would be particularly important, and we measured the water diffusion that was going on in those fibers. And what we found was that indeed, the more brain injuries a woman had, the lower that value was. And that value was then associated a little bit late. There wasn't quite, if we want to use statistical terms, statistically significant, but it was a trend, so it was close. There's suggestive evidence that that value was actually related to her ability to learn that list of words that I was talking about earlier. So again, a real meaningful impact in her life, potentially, having this go on in her brain. So the next thing I'm going to talk about briefly is, so what does all this mean? I mean, does this mean that women are sustaining these brain injuries and their lives are ruined, they can't recover? And the answer is, I don't know. I've done the only imaging studies that we know of out there, which I think is incredibly sad, and we really need to change that. And there's very few other studies just looking at TBIs and what they're related to with anything in this population, despite the thousands of studies that have been done with athletes and the military. So I really can't say a lot. But what I can say is that if anything, I'm going to guess that when we start looking at this, because we will and we are, we're going to find out that it's a little bit even harder for these women to recover from these brain injuries. But not impossible, but I just want to tell you why. Recovery is affected by a number of different factors. One of them being the acute management of TBI. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of these women don't sustain just one. They sustain repetitive traumatic brain injuries, and they may not have time even to recover. And previous concussion is also an indicator for poor recovery. What else is a poor indicator of recovery? Biological health. So these women, as you can imagine, often have other problems that are associated with their abuse. They may have broken arms, they may have a punctured lung, they may have a broken eardrum, but that's not going to help them recover from their brain injury. They also have intense distress from the abusive relationship. General life stress, again, trying to manage your regular life and also navigate yourself through this abusive relationship. And sex. The jury's a little bit out, but there's a lot of evidence right now to suggest that when a woman sustains a concussion, there's going to be a longer time to recover than when a man sustains a concussion. And there's also some data to show that the axons that I was telling you about earlier may be a little bit thinner in women, which would make some sense in the context of why that may be the case in terms of the recovery. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is, okay, well, what does this mean? Does this mean that these women can't do anything? Does it make her, for example, unfit? Because this has come up, and I think this is important to address. And the answer is no. Having a TBI does not make someone unfit. And this is important, especially if we're going to think about in the legal system where judges may be involved or something like that. I think this is crucial to make sure we don't ever lose sight of the fact that it does not make someone unfit. What it might do is it might make it harder to establish a safety plan, for a woman to stay safe from her abuser or to get out. It might make it harder for a woman to leave an abusive relationship. And it might make it more difficult for women to successfully obtain, for example, an order of protection. So basically what I'm trying to say here is it doesn't make a woman unfit, but it may make the possibility of her getting herself out of a really difficult and abusive situation even that much harder. So who is this relevant for? The stuff that I'm talking about today. Who do I want to reach with this information? And the answer is a lot of people. First, the women themselves. I've had a lot of women call me up and say, oh my gosh, this is what's going on. I had no idea. Yeah, I've been wondering why I have these problems. And it helps them to make sense of some things. And hopefully for women who are in relationships, it gives them another piece of information to help guide where they may try to put their energies to move forward. The police and other first responders. So when police or ambulance folks or someone show up at the scene of a crime, there's a domestic violence call, they show up and they see a woman, and she may be saying, I don't know how I got from that room to the other room, or I don't know, it's confusing, or I was in here, and then 2 minutes later she says something different. And to police and first responders, it may look like she's lying, or it may look like she's on drugs or alcohol. And that's usually what people are going to think. What does not occur to them, typically, is maybe she just sustained a traumatic brain injury. Maybe she's really confused. So think of a football player on the field. When he's knocked out and he gets up, you don't start asking him questions. If you ask him a question and he says something that's off the wall, you don't call him a liar. You say, oh, yeah, of course, this guy just had a concussion. Women are not getting that benefit of the doubt because people are not thinking to ask these questions. The same can be said of judges. Judges will not necessarily know that a woman's story is inconsistent because maybe she had a traumatic brain injury and things changed for her. She couldn't remember it right, then she did remember, or whatever. Also, advocates, friends, and family. It's really important for all of these people to understand that there may be a brain injury involved and that interacting with the person you're trying to help needs to take into account the idea that it may be harder for her to process what you're trying to tell her, the information you're trying to give her. So, next is what to expect. I just told you, okay, if you have someone you're trying to help, or if the police show up, what are the types of things you can expect in terms of expecting to find a TBI? Well, first, and this goes pretty much across the board for the women that I have spoken with, don't expect to see any medical records. Most of these women do not go to the ER, do not go to the hospital when they have traumatic brain injuries unless they're severe or moderate to severe. And so they really go completely overlooked by medical personnel. Also, don't expect to see abnormalities in imaging scans. Sometimes people say, oh, then I really want to get this woman to have an MRI or something like that. Unfortunately, concussions are not well identified on an individual basis in MRIs or CAT scans. The data that I was telling you about earlier is based on group data, and so we can infer information from that by looking at patterns. But on an individual level, unfortunately, you won't necessarily see anything. So what do you look for? Expect to see someone who may appear disoriented, distractible, inconsistent, complaining of headaches, maybe depressed or anxious or worried, maybe even uncooperative, maybe irritable. Irritability is a sign of traumatic brain injuries. And then, if you're going to find out from her, don't expect to have her offer up the information. By the way, I sustained a brain injury. That's not usually how it goes. They often don't realize they sustained a brain injury, and it's only through certain types of questioning that you can find this out. But what you may get from a clue that may tell you that this is an important thing to ask might be something like, we're arguing, and then I found myself getting up from the floor. He punched me in my head. I fell backwards and hit the wall. I'm not sure how I got into the other room. So, for example, that might be either a loss of consciousness and he carried her, or there's some post-traumatic amnesia. So the last thing I want to end with is just talking about some practical, here we go. I do want to say that I have already said this, but there are often no visible signs of injury, and as I said, women rarely seek medical attention. So please do not rely on that. Okay, so what can we do if we have someone that is in a partner abusive situation and we think may have sustained a brain injury and may be struggling with certain cognitive issues? First, minimize distractions. Meet in quiet locations, have short meetings or breaks. And this is, think about if you're an advocate, working with somebody, even if you're a friend or a family member trying to help that woman get a safety plan together or get an order of protection or set up a bank account so he doesn't try to take her money when she leaves. So this would be an example of something you might do. Avoid loud noises and bright lights. Provide a notebook or a calendar or a journal. Repeat information. Have checklists and prioritize goals, make smaller steps, and write them out. And just a few more. Focus on one task at a time. Sometimes women are told a list of things to do. Get the order of protection, do this, do that, get these records from the courthouse, do this. And then they come back and they haven't done anything. And they're like, well, why didn't you do anything? And the woman just, I tried. I forgot what I was supposed to do. I couldn't keep track. So focus on one task at a time. Talk slowly and to the point. Double check with her to be sure that she understood the information. So have her repeat it back to you. Help fill out forms. Make phone calls. Identify support personnel. And then be supportive and identify strengths. Even when women are down and they have issues and they can't remember, maybe they're depressed, there's still things in there that you can find that are strengths, and capitalize on those. And so the last thing I just want to talk for one last minute is, what can we do? I can't stress enough the importance of talking about this issue. We ignore this issue. We pretend it's not there. It's around us. It's everywhere. This is happening to our daughters, our mothers, our friends, our coworkers. 1 in 3 women experience physical or sexual abuse. There is no way pretty much everyone in here has not interacted with someone on a pretty personal basis who has experienced this. Raise awareness in whatever way you can. Talk to people about it. Mention it in strange situations. Also, demand that funds be appropriated for research aimed at understanding this international public health epidemic. There is a ton of resources for athletes, a ton of resources for the military. There's a lot of money going there, and there is absolutely nothing going towards this group of women. And we need to change that. Finally, let every woman know that she has the right to be healthy and safe. With that, I'll say thank you.
Thank you. I want to start first by thanking the Ontario Brain Institute for inviting me to share my experiences with you, and to tell you one of the stories of all the Canadians and women around the world that have experienced this type of abuse in a relationship. Mine is but one of these stories. And I recognize that sharing lived experiences of domestic and intimate partner violence can be hard to hear, as there are some ugly truths that come out with this topic. However, I believe that only in actually facing the ugly will we truly be able to assist in helping those that experience this type of abuse. My story begins with being swept off my feet by a young, charismatic man during my summer employment right after I graduated from university. Like many women survivors, the beginning of my relationship was exciting. I was 22 years old, a university grad, and was ready to start my life as a young woman. We met at our summer job in Ottawa. My coworkers all thought he was a dashing young man. He was furthering his education, starting his master's in the fall. So when he took an interest in me, I felt very lucky. We had a very romantic beginning, going out for dinners, taking in live jazz shows, cooking together, and reciting poetry. It seemed as though we were ready to share our lives together, and within months we confessed our love for one another and made plans to move in together. Through the romance, I didn't take much notice of how much he was isolating me from my friends and family by making me question the sincerity of those relationships. Nor did I think that his suggestion of spending time at his place while he went out with his friends was a method of him keeping track of my social activities. When he suggested that I wear certain clothes or do my hair in a certain way, or advised me how to communicate with other people, it seemed thoughtful, and it happened so seamlessly that I did not recognize how even my own perception of myself was being controlled by him. I don't remember exactly when I first experienced the physical abuse. The controlling elements of our relationship began quite early on, with disagreements if we had differing views or opinions on topics. At first, it was hours of arguing until I agreed with his point of view. Gradually, the arguments escalated with belongings being broken, such as a CD or a kitchen utensil. Eventually, the violence evolved to a slap, a kick, or a punch. It was a gradual increase over time, but it wasn't always a steady increase, nor did it occur daily. Once the physical power and control, some of those arguments and disagreements would result in physical restraint. Then the next might escalate to yelling. It was difficult to predict how far an argument would go. With the peaks and valleys of abuse, the threshold of how bad it is shifts. At one point, my arm was squeezed so hard, there was a bruise on my arm from his handprint. Then the next time, I would be punched in the face and would have a black eye. The next time, he might overpower me so he could restrain me from leaving and spit in my face. None of these situations are okay. But because the last one doesn't appear to have lasting visible scars, I minimized the effect that every incident had on me, and would think that since I didn't leave when he punched my face and gave me deep bruising to my torso, I shouldn't leave now, because maybe, just maybe, he is getting better. But it didn't get better. Over time, it was getting worse. Over the years, our relationship, I had multiple injuries, physically, emotionally, and psychologically. The physical injuries included bruising over my entire body at different times. I, like many women, would hide the physical marks with clothing or makeup, or make excuses. Sometimes it would be necessary for me to change my plans at the last minute, which I'm sure raised some concerns from time to time. But if it didn't raise concerns, it was never mentioned. I would regularly have bruises on various parts of my body. I would be walking with a limp because of a Charlie horse. And I would be going into public places with bruising on my face. And it wasn't until I actually spoke to somebody and said that I am not able to finish a project because I was being held hostage and I had bruising on my face. And that was the reason that I wasn't able to make it. It was at that moment that I actually pointed it out, that it was actually seen. So during the 8 years of my intimate violent relationship, only once did I actually go to the hospital for medical attention. On that particular day, I had been hit in various places, including having my head hit off a wall. This was not the first, nor, unfortunately, was it the last time that I was hit in the head. On several occasions, I had tried to call the police and was bashed on the head with the phone after he grabbed it from my hand. But in this particular moment, it was only by chance that I was able to escape from the apartment on that day, that I was able to grab footwear, my purse, and get away without him finding where I went. I was able to make it to a friend's house, one that I didn't think he would know that I would go to. And when I arrived at my friend's doorstep, she was very supportive. She brought me into her home and listened to what had happened. And of course, she suggested I should go to the hospital, but I wasn't so easily convinced. After several hours and her calling the Interval House crisis line, I agreed to let her take me to the hospital. While at the hospital, I did go through a medical examination. I remember that the doctor noted that I had bruising on several places in my body that were at various stages of healing. From this, he correctly concluded that I had experienced physical abuse on a fairly regular basis at this point. The examination that took place was not very long, and the question of a traumatic brain injury was quickly dismissed with asking a couple of questions and looking at my eyes. There was not any follow-up that was suggested or symptoms that should be watched for. Granted, this took place over 15 years ago, before concussions were widely discussed, but the lack of awareness of the severity of this situation still exists. I did not leave right after this particular incident. I think I was gone for about a day before I went back. It was one of my many attempts to leave. In fact, I went back to the, I tried leaving again 6 months later, after many more violent incidents, and I was able to stay away for several months, but was drawn back in from his promises to change. I finally left the relationship about 2.5 years after that incident that I had medical attention. Leaving a relationship is never easy, and leaving an abusive relationship can add particular safety concerns as well. The main reason, of course, is because the abuser is losing their power and control, and their behavior becomes even more unpredictable. When I finally did leave, I was stalked and harassed. Listening to the woman's safety plan is very important, making sure that she's going to be safe. Leaving and finding a place where she can be safe is very important for both her and those around her. Thank you very much for allowing me the opportunity to share with you today, and I really appreciate that I was able to do so on International Women's Day. If you have any questions, they can be directed to the Twitter and be answered later in the show.
First of all, I want to start by thanking the Ontario Brain Institute for hosting and for supporting this event, and Dr. Valera for coming from Harvard to share, and of course Deirdre for sharing your personal experience of concussion and intimate partner violence. The Ontario Brain Injury Association has been helping and supporting people living with brain injury for over 30 years. And we strive to bring awareness to the general public about brain injury and concussion. And one of the areas, as we have heard tonight, one of the areas that gets very little attention is concussion or brain injuries and domestic violence. In fact, as Dr. Valera mentioned, very little work and awareness about brain injury, domestic violence, or intimate partner violence has been addressed. And obviously, this is a very serious issue. And up until this point, Canada has been actually largely silent on this issue. And it's only been in the last couple of years that it has started to come a little bit to the forefront. And we at OBI have a passion to bring this to the forefront so that we can better support those who have sustained brain injuries or concussions through domestic violence. At the Ontario Brain Injury Association, as Tom mentioned, we developed a campaign called Concussion Hits Home, and we developed a short awareness video that I would like to share with you now. Our message here today is that both from a professional and personal perspective, we must speak up and support people who have sustained brain injuries through domestic violence. We need to continue to educate the general public, the government, and those who support survivors of domestic violence to clearly get the message across that concussions and brain injuries are not restricted simply to the hockey rink, the football arena, or the soccer field. And as Dr. Eve Valera shared, very little research or even dollars are going into this. It is our goal that through increased awareness and education that survivors will be able to receive the appropriate treatment and support. The need for supporting people living with brain injury is great, and OBI is here to help those who are struggling. And we can help in a variety of ways. And one of the things when we talked about putting this symposium on was I said we really need to get the point across. We need to bring awareness to this issue, but we also need to share that there is support for those who are survivors of intimate partner violence and have sustained concussions or brain injuries. And we can help in a number of ways. We have a 1-800 helpline that people can call. We've received over 90,000 calls on our helpline. We also have a peer support program. And this is a wonderful program that connects an individual whose life experience helps another person who is coping with a similar ABI-related situation and is in need of support from a knowledgeable friend. So we could have somebody like Deirdre, who could be a mentor to a person who has recently sustained a concussion through intimate partner violence, and they will be able to talk about what that experience is like for them. We also carry out personal advocacy. We provide educational support. So we'll work with a client or a family member and help to educate them on what a brain injury is and the consequences of brain injury. We also provide resources to assist them, or we direct them to their local community brain injury association, which provide many different supports and programs. But through this whole process at OBI, if somebody calls us, we are providing emotional support. Because sometimes there are times when circumstances arise that our hands are tied and practically we may not be able to do anything. Therefore, even more so during those times, the importance of emotional support is crucial. If you know of someone, whether professionally, whether you're working in the social services field, if you know somebody who has sustained a concussion or brain injury through intimate partner violence, or perhaps you know somebody personally who is in need of support, OBI is here to help. And when you came in, there were booths up there, and one of our staff, Tanya, is at our booth, and she'd be happy to assist you. And it is our goal that through this talk today, that awareness has been brought to the issue, but equally as important is that those who have sustained a concussion or brain injury through intimate partner violence are not alone. There is help, and OBI is here to help. Thank you so much.
Hello, I'm Heather Mallick, and I am so honored to have been invited to moderate our talk this evening. I am quite shocked by the information we've been given this evening, and I hope that many people are tweeting in their questions so that we can find out more. I'm going to ask some questions, perhaps that we weren't able to cover, not quite as much during your speeches, which were fascinating and touching and informative. Now, Eve, I'd like to ask you why it is that women don't leave.
So I think that's a great question, and I often do address it in my my talks, because I think what happens is I will get up there and I will say women get stomped on, they have their head stomped on, they get hit in the head with a baseball bat, they have their head slammed into a wall every time, and their husband walks into the house, and if he's in a good mood, it's just a little bit of a slam, but if he's grumpy, it's really like a dinger. And so I think people sometimes are sitting there, and I know I've had some questions. It's sort of like, well, if it's really that bad, I mean, come on, this doesn't make sense. Who the heck is going to tolerate that? Now, Deirdre gave a really good example of how it's hard to get out by illustrating some of the things that she went through. And her story is not at all atypical. The truth is there are a ton of factors. I could probably talk here for an hour. I won't. But there are so many factors. I think the most important one is that the most dangerous time for a woman to leave, most dangerous time for a woman is when she's either about to leave, leaving, or after she's left. That's when women get killed. Women are, the homicide rate that we're talking about, when women leave and after they leave, they're stalked, and sometimes women will be out of the relationship when they're killed. And that's just one of the many reasons. The other reason is sometimes, as Deirdre was saying, they've been isolated by their partners for years. They don't really have a good support network, so they don't have a place to go. And then maybe they are the caretaker of the children, so they don't have any financial support. Where are they going to go? And then how are you going to take the kids with you? And if you are suffering with brain injuries, trying to figure out a situation that can a way to safely get out of that situation is incredibly difficult. There's financial issues, there's safety issues, there's child care, there's isolation. I could go on, but those are just some of the many reasons. The bottom line, though, is if you're in a relationship like this, it's not like you're just sitting there enjoying it. It's not like, oh, she should just go. Well, if she really wanted to get out, she should. It's extremely dangerous and sometimes almost impossible for these women to leave without help.
Understood. Thank you. Did you find that that was what happened to you in your situation, that that's why it dragged on for so many awful years?
Definitely, there were issues about that. Not having a safe place to go. And when you do leave, you are questioning whether or not if you made it up. You're dealing with so many other things, especially when you have been hit in the head and you've been told numerous times that the reason that this is happening is because you caused it. So there's so many different elements that are really playing at that, at you with that. And mind you, there's a lot more knowledge in society. There's a lot more places that you can go, and the information is there a lot easier than it was in the past. That doesn't mean that it's any easier necessarily for women to escape. But there's a lot of elements, especially when you're connected with your futures, with your monetary, that, sometimes when I finally did leave, I left with what I could fit into the back of a friend's car, and sometimes it's just, you have to take that leap, but you have to make sure that the woman is ready for that leap.
Understood. Thank you. I wanted to ask you if part of my job as a columnist is to see overarching patterns. Do you think that there's a similarity in other areas, that our lack of knowledge about women's brains also equals a lack of knowledge about women's hearts, about women's medications that we all take, that we've been neglected throughout human history, not just our brains, not just our thoughts, but also our bodies in every way?
Well, I think it's a great question, Heather, on International Women's Day. Yeah. And certainly the research does demonstrate that, and there's a wonderful researcher in Toronto, Dr. Angela Colantonio, who does fantastic research on gender differences, and particularly when it comes to issues around concussions. And I think that we do have to look at that we are not all necessarily exactly the same. And as you mentioned, research, and again, I'm not a researcher. We work practically and on the ground in the community with people living with brain injuries, but certainly we do know that there are differences. And I think probably Dr. Eve Valera can speak a little bit more to the specific research when it comes to the brain and how men and women may be different, and particularly I think around the treatment and the outcomes.
Is it overall, do you think that this has been ignored because men are seen as the gold standard? They're the basic, and we're the extras that surround them. So our taking care of women is a frill almost, that we're just something that is, oh, and by the way, we'll also look at that. Do you get that sensation when you try and explain to audiences how serious this violence is?
So if we're, I mean, when you talk about research, yeah. So when I go to, say, for example, NIH, or I talk to certain people and I say, well, I need money to try to do this research, I've literally gotten the comment, oh, well, there's, you know, tons of research out there. There's tons of research on repetitive mild traumatic brain injuries. What more do you need to do? And I said, well, no, there's only one study on my topic. And they said, well, then you've already done it. Now, if you were to tell the football players or the athletes or the military, well, wait a minute, we can't say there's one because there's millions of studies, maybe not, I don't know, but thousands of studies. You wouldn't say, oh, there's one, so you've already done it. You'd never say that. Yet this is the type of comments that I get back. And the idea that we should just use the knowledge that was acquired studying men who have completely different psychosocial circumstances and try to apply that to women is just crazy. Women, you know, who are, you know, have all these negative recovery factors. But yes, I think that, I mean, to use the word misogyny is probably not a wrong word to use here. There's a little bit of that. There's victim blaming. Unfortunately, women in these situations are often just seen, it goes back to the question of why don't they leave? There's a story of a woman who was, you know, in an ambulance, and the whatever you call him, the ambulance person, he looks at her and he says, gee, lady, what did you do to deserve this? And, you know, they may not have really meant, but that's really sort of, that's kind of, that didn't come out of nowhere. The idea that they instigate it, it's their fault, and if it's not, they should just leave. And so why should we bother studying this? And like you said, this isn't just this particular question. Females are typically left out, and even if you look at research in the animal world, it's almost all on male animals. So there has to be a change there. And in the U.S., at least, the National Institute of Health, they are trying to rectify that some by mandating that females be included in certain things.
And if I could just add to that, when we think, and I think it's marvelous work that's being done in research as far as football and CTE and football players who sustain multiple concussions. And I think it's fantastic work that's being done and that's being addressed at that level. However, if you equate that to a woman who has been repeatedly hit in the head over and over without that chance to recover, if you compare those two, there's a lot of similarities between the woman who sustains concussions over and over again and a football player. And I know that Eve, you had mentioned in one of your other talks that there may be, it's being hypothesized that women may have CTE who have been repeatedly hit in the head.
I couldn't sit here and say we know that's the case. We don't have any. We don't have any research. Okay, that's the problem. That's the biggest problem, I should say. But there are women who have come to me with their stories, who are in their mid-40s, and they're complaining of things that they're just like, well, I have a college, I can read at a college level, but now I go and there's a word that I see on the page, and I can't figure out what it is. I have to go to the dictionary and look it up. It scares me. Or I'll be in the middle of a conversation, and I just can't get the word that I'm supposed to say to that person. It scares me. And this is a woman who's a bright woman, and she had a horribly abusive relationship with lots of hits to the head. And now later on, she's seeing these issues, and she's not the only person who I have spoken to who has mentioned these types of things. I can't say that, this is CTE. We certainly don't know that, but we need to try to find that out. We need to see if something is there, because it wouldn't be surprising.
How can emergency room, I hate to use that traditional phrase, first responders, how can they be told to look for this more closely?
Well, I think it goes exactly to education. And one of the things that we would like to do with our association is to bring education to first responders so that they can understand that some of the symptomology that they're seeing could be a result of a concussion or brain injury, and not simply, chalked up to, but misinterpreted as purely a mental health issue.
Here we have some tweeted questions, very good ones. What kind of support, if I could ask you, Deirdre, is available to women in abusive relationships when they haven't yet left?
The one that I reached out to, there's the informal ones, your friends, your family, of course. But I found the interval house. There's interval houses across Ontario, I know. I believe that there's similar sorts of things in different provinces as well. And there's a crisis line that you can call. And the people that are working on those crisis lines, they've dealt with it themselves, sometimes firsthand, sometimes secondhand. So they're very supportive. You're able to get some advice. As I said, on that one evening that I went, I think that was the first time that the interval house was called on my behalf. But it definitely was not the last time that I've used them, and that's where I would turn first.
Thank you. Another tweeper, I call them, my tweeps. How can we support women who are experiencing this kind of violence or others, and how can we encourage them to seek medical care? I think going to see a doctor in ER is absolutely terrifying. I always tell my children, don't go without a significant other, someone who can speak for you, because your memory isn't necessarily good. You don't know what's happened.
Well, I think that going to your family doctor, even if you're lucky enough to have one, somebody that you're able to have that repeated contact with, because that's definitely going to be a follow-up where it's the same person and you're not going to have to start your story over and over again. If you are going to the emergency, most emergencies do have specific things for domestic violence. Specific teams that can help, but bringing a friend or somebody that you trust with you as well so that they can take notes, because you're not going to remember everything that's happening.
That's right. One final question. I hope it doesn't offend anybody, but have you found women that you talk to who have suffered this, do they prefer to go to a woman doctor?
I've gone to both men and women doctors. Both, I think, have the majority of them. Women, you seem to think that you're going to have a little bit more sympathy. I think on some level, but the men, the male doctors as well, they're there to support you. They understand that these things happen as well. So the physician at the ER when I first went, it was a man, and even though he minimized the head injury, definitely what stuck in my mind is the fact that he recognized that there was bruising.
That's wonderful. That's very good to hear. These have been excellent questions, and you've all spoken so wonderfully about many, many aspects of concussion as suffered by women in their homes, in intimate violence, and I'm just so grateful to you all on International Women's Day that you've been able to talk about this. There are 4 information booths outside where you can get more information on what you can do in a situation like that, or ways you can be prepared for a friend who has this problem. It increases awareness. You know what you should look for now, and if you see a woman with a bruise or a missing tooth, or someone who looks shattered in the way that they have been intended to be shattered by a man who's been doing this to them for years, then it's just a way of learning how to spot this kind of suffering. It's been a great evening. Thank you all very much. And thank you, audience.